I'll now move on to our next speaker, who is actually in the room, Burzine Waghmar. He's quite a known face to us here because he's attended some of our briefings in the past as well. Burzine is the inaugural Visiting India Fellow for Royal United Services Institute, London. He's also the South Asia and Arts and Humanities Librarian and academic affiliate at the Center of Iranian Studies, Center for Study of Pakistan, and SOAS South Asia Institute, School of Oriental and African Studies. Burzine is also a fellow of European Foundation for South Asia Studies at The Hague. I now invite Burzine to come and deliver his speech.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairs, Honorable Parliamentarians, APPG Secretariat and Mr. Tiku, guests, good evening. I'm conscious of the honor in contributing to this newly established all parties parliamentary group on the Indo-Pacific Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. I propose as a historian to afford some insights, as my title indicates, on Chinese perceptions and misperceptions of the Quad and its role in the Indo-Pacific. These comments are not exhaustive but suggestive, for they will enable us, looking on from England, to obtain a profounder and hopefully sounder comprehension of what molds the PRC, People's Republic of China, and the CCP, Chinese Communist Party leadership's worldview. This examination will reveal that the CCP has a distinct take on the Indo-Pacific and that its outlook is consistent with Chinese approaches towards traditional and non-traditional security thinking
Sorry, you are frozen. We can't hear you.
Can you hear now? Yeah, I think there was a bit of a...
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe start where you left off.
Sentence.
Strategically at the beginning, and maybe leave out the...
Yes.
Our departure point at this APPG, and I posit also at other committees in both chambers of parliament deliberating on Sino-British relations, should be this fundament prevalent in contemporary Chinese thinking, and it is this. The Chinese dream, Zhongguoming, harking to reformers of the late Qing epoch, 1644 to 1912, informs Xi Jinping's ultimate evolution and transformation of China. 100 years of the CCP, the Communist Party's establishment, July 2021, which has created a, quote, moderately prosperous society in Chinese officialese, and the PRC's founding, October 2049, when it will become the most powerful modern socialist country. The 2100s was proposed in a report following the 15th National Congress of the CCP, 1997, and enunciated at its 18th session, 2012. Henry Kissinger remarked on this at the Margaret Thatcher Conference on Security, Guildhall, London, July 2017. Quote, this evolution will mark the third transformation of China in the last half century. Mao's brought unity, Deng's brought reform, and now Xi Jinping is seeking to fulfill what he calls the Chinese dream, going back to the late Qing reformers by realizing the 2100s. When the PRC enters its second 100 years in 2049, it will, in Xi's definition, be as powerful as, if not more powerful than, any other society in the world, close quote. Second, Sinocentrism is the principal coefficient in forming and inspiring the Chinese worldview. At its core is the principal belief that China, as perceived by the Chinese, is neither a nation nor a state. It is a center of a civilization, which is what Zhongguo literally renders in English, country at the center or central state. And like the French, it carries that connotation of la mission civilisatrice, civilizing mission in its dealings with others. China is the center of the known world, and again has been proposed for France, an idea necessary for civilization. China stood forth all under heaven, Tianxia, with other peoples and polities, depending on their degree of refinement and culture, as either tributary vassals or downright barbarians. Chinese diplomacy, then and now, is hierarchical and non-egalitarian. Foreign relations were predicated on concentric circles with those who have a claim to being civilized, example, Korea or India, in propinquity to the Middle Kingdom, whereas others further away, Central Asian marauders, most notably the Mongols, as uncivilized. This Sinocentrism survived into the modern period and was not watered down by Marxist-Leninism or Maoism. Han nationalism was never tempered by progressive leftist thinking, which goes to explain China's frontier policy towards Tibet and Xinjiang, absorbed into the PRC in 1950 and 1955 respectively, whose indigenous inhabitants are, as cultural anthropologist Caroline McGrahan pointed out in a learned study, quote, different via their evolutionarily backward status. For the Chinese state, interpretation of nationality sets Han Chinese as the default category, close quote. The late John Fairbank of Harvard coined the tribute system to encapsulate the Chinese sense of world order. Chinese emperors bestowed trading privileges and thus organized foreign relations as well as consolidated security objectives. Chinese material wealth and capacity enabled it to set the rules of the game, dictate modes of appropriate behavior, reward those who acquiesced, and punished those who crossed red lines, as Yuan Kang Wang notes in his assessment recently published in the Routledge Handbook of Chinese Security. Thus, China was able to transform the uncivilized into civilized and unthreatening to unthreatening. Everyone thus prospered so long as they recognize Chinese suzerainty, with China providing the public good of security and welfare. Something familiar in our century with the BRI, Belt and Road Project. Not so much a Marshall Plan as China's grand strategy for leveraging relations with countries to offset its domestic overcapacity, generate foreign currency reserves, disseminate Chinese style governance methods as an alternative to market-oriented, universal, transactional, and legal norms of the post-1945 liberal rule-based international order. But let me insert a qualifier lest we overextend the Sinocentrism argument. It is, when all is said and done, a civilizational concept, not a toolkit which the PRC deploys in conducting relations. Also, China was not always regional hegemon, much less Asiatic superpower. There were several periods when China was weak, disunited, and impoverished. China, as Victoria Tinmore notes, was unified for less than 50% of the time in the last 2,000 years. Confucian pacifism is an aspect of Sinocentrism extensively dilated upon by sinologists as well as strategists. Chinese thinkers have, in a vast corpus of literature, been at pains to point out essential Sinitic features of non-aggressiveness and China's essentially peaceful, defensive, harmonious worldview. This is evinced in the foreign policy rhetoric deployed by successive Chinese leaders to preach and moralize others. Not that dissimilar from Nehruvian thinking and India's non-aligned sermonizing, which did not exactly endear it to Western powers during the Cold War. A telling recent example is the chill between Canberra and Beijing and the latter's embargo on $20 billion worth of Australian barley, beef, coal, gas, iron ore, lobster, and wine imports. 8 years ago, a free trade deal was inked between them, and President Xi boasted of having visited each and every Australian state on his official visit. But the dive in diplomatic relations has been quite something. As The Economist dryly put it in its 26th November issue, quote, pesky little Australia was considered in Beijing to have offended the cosmic order, close quote. In November 2020, China enumerated its 14 grievances, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry urged Canberra, I quote verbatim here, to correct its behavior. Australia has done nothing of the sort. Partly explainable by the fact that China needs Australia, especially its iron ore and natural gas, even if lobsters can be shipped in from elsewhere. 1,000 wine businesses folded up, and the incomes of many Tasmanian fishermen were halved. But Canberra kept a steady course and was able to convince its business lobbies, as well as our ordinary Australians, that succumbing to bullying would only lead to more demands. A perfunctory thought was evinced when President Xi met Prime Minister Albanese briefly on the margins of the G20 last month in Bali. They are, come September 2023, scheduled to meet in Delhi. And to conclude this introductory outline, let me revert briefly to the question of Confucian harmony. Chinese belligerence since 1949 is not restricted to Taiwan or India. Territorial disputes are ongoing with Vietnam, Philippines, and Japan. It is a fallacy to maintain that China was largely non-militaristic or that its style of warfare has been merely defensive. China waged between 770 BC and 1912 of the last century 3,756 civil wars and external campaigns. Chinese historian Shi Yinhong maintains that the Chinese military tradition, quote, is more Napoleonic than even Napoleon, close quote. The historical legacy that China has been largely non-violent strains credulity. And the legacy of Chinese security policy, again, as Yuan Kang Wang notes, quote, is one of realpolitik based on rational assessments of relative, repeat, relative power between China and the competitors, close quote. A mention of Chinese border disputes in the East and South China Seas leads us to foreground these ongoing crises in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, hitherto known in American geopolitical strategic circles as the Asia-Pacific, refers to those water bodies stretching from the Pacific Ocean's eastern rim, west coast of North American landmass, to the Indian Ocean on the East African littoral. Between the Indian and Pacific Oceans lie the Indian subcontinent, Maldives and Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Korean Peninsula, Japan, Taiwan, and Oceania, an immense stretch of islands, almost 800,000 kilometers of land, and 10,000 islands of over 20 countries and territories. Perceive the Indo-Pacific in terms of securitizing and dominating the South China Sea through concentric lines with its sight perpetually set on Taiwan, a first island chain. American-administered Marianas, Guam and Palau, a second chain, and according to Japanese analysts, now a third chain in the Western Pacific, with naval berthing, thus Australia encircling arrangements in lieu of economic assistance to the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu. The geostrategic importance now afforded to this part of the world is evinced when the US Department of Defense renamed in May 2018 its Armed Forces Unified Combatant Command, US Pacific Command, USPACOM, to the US Indo-Pacific Command. This is partly necessitated to underscore, as the Pentagon declared, our strategic partner India, whose inclusion in the Quad and future role as a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific. Chinese perceptions of the Pacific rest on a quartet of national interests. First, Chinese anxieties of American presence can be traced to the US presence, both alliances and bases, in the Western Pacific. Japan may be non-nuclear, but it anchors the first island chain and will continue to conduct military exercises regularly with American forces. China's vital hydrocarbon flows, which emanate from the Persian Gulf and pass through the Indian Ocean, as well as its export-import sea traffic through the Western Pacific and North Pacific to North America, and again the Western Pacific to Southeast Asia and beyond, are proximate to American naval presence in the region. This accounts for 90% of all international trade and 40% of its petrol imports. Hence, unmentioned but not unacknowledged that any conflict in or near Taiwan, or the South China Sea for that matter, will not be regionally restricted. Whatever else can be said about American tensions with some of its Asian allies, whether trade wars or human rights, it is a patent fact, as Harvard's Joseph Nye pointed out, Asian states, as a rule, welcome a Western presence as a Chinese counterweight. This is only grimly familiar with the onset of the Ukraine war, as South Korea and Japan have been pressing the Biden administration to firm up its guarantees for Taiwan. Second, marine defense strategy, as the Chinese Navy is developing a blue water capability, including aircraft carriers operable beyond land-based air and missile defense systems. Thus, Chinese focus on that first island chain, as I explained, the Senkaku, Ryukyu, Paracel, and Spratly Islands. Beijing maintains it needs to break through the second island chain within the ambit of Washington and its allies, Marianas to Guam, Micronesia, Australia, and New Zealand. Third, promoting the One China policy by disestablishing diplomatic relations with Taipei. 4 of Taiwan's 15 diplomatic allies in the Pacific are Palau, Nauru, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. Chinese soft power comes into play here, for Chinese prosperity has enabled it to increase its largesse, so much so that it is now the second largest Pacific island donor after Australia. The Solomon Islands and Kiribati suspended all ties with Taiwan for the PRC in 2019. A point to be borne in any analysis of developmental aid is that Chinese aid comes, so it is perceived by Pacific Islanders, with less hassles. Beijing only requests that free market, read Western principles, be set aside. What is known as the Washington Consensus, as propounded by Western developmental aid donors, tends to append several preconditions, namely transparency, due diligence and good governance, alleged interference with prevalent business frameworks, and revisions to the local developmental agenda. Fourth, and finally, access to Chinese markets, with Beijing projecting itself as a fellow, developing, non-Western nation, which seeks only amicable commercial relations and brings no political agenda to the table by lecturing these nations on how to govern their affairs, organize their national budgets, and spur private sector-led growth and slash public funding. It is obvious that Chinese aid, low-interest preferential loans favoring primary industries such as agriculture and fishing, is observed as buying influence in terms of future possibilities without present preconditions. Note that most Pacific Island societies still depend on local subsistence supplemented by cash crops. China has the advantage of portraying itself in the image of a non-imperialist entity which never occupied the Pacific as a colonial outlier only, and whose value never went beyond nuclear testing in a distant setting far from the metropolitan West, whose denizens' lives were not to be risked by such military initiatives. Note, the PRC conducted its first ICBM test only in 1980, when its missile landed in open ocean, 1,200 kilometers northwest of Fiji and nearly 10,000 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. The Americans, British, and French were conducting atmospheric and underwater testing in this part of the world since the onset of the Cold War. China can, and indeed does, place a premium on demonstrating how its phenomenal growth has been undertaken by state-run directives, with the private sector still heavily regulated by central command. In so doing, a Chinese blueprint for a developed future is purported, which has not been in thrall to Western normative or mercantile practices. I stated earlier that Asian nations welcome not just American but Western presence. It is fitting I conclude this parliamentary briefing by coming full circle home to the United Kingdom, which will constitute the kernel of another thesis, a policy paper I am now preparing for the APPG-Indo-Pacific on global Britain and the Indo-Pacific, which is now part of the AUS-UK trilateral security arrangement initiated in September 2021. Tokyo, as Cleo Pascal pointed out in her authoritative Chatham House policy paper, has been pressing for London to become more active in the Indo-Pacific theatre. To that aim, an Anglo-Japanese joint statement released in 2019 enunciated our global strategic partnership. To quote Cleo Pascal, an interviewed British official stated to her that Tokyo was, quote, prodding the UK with a stick to engage more, close quote. There has been discussion in Quad circles, as Pascal has also cited, to expand the Five Eyes intelligence arrangement to now include Tokyo. That quintet of English-speaking nations, Canada, US, UK, was to include another English-speaking parliamentary constitutional democracy that turned 75 this year, India. It is an idea whose time will come, perhaps not in the near, but assuredly medium-term future. This is imperative if we profess to share those very socio-political values upheld by Canberra, New Delhi, Tokyo, and DC. Open society is grounded in democratic conventions, rules-based transparency in governance, trade, and development, sustaining regional peace by a credible deterrence contra overt covert threats from state and non-state belligerents. The twin objectives of regional security and economic stability
Hi, the screen is and the sound is frozen for us again.
realizable by the
Are we back?
Much has been ambitiously
Last 1 minute.
Much has been ambitiously mentioned in our integrated review of security, defense, development, and foreign policy announced in March 2021 as the most promising and exhaustive review undertaken since the end of the Cold War. Much store has been set in it about it of an Indo-Pacific tilt. Our Foreign Office, under then Foreign Secretary Johnson, opened 3 new British diplomatic missions in Oceania, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. But much more needs to be done for the integration recently as overpromises and underdelivers by Baroness Annalay, Chair of the House of Lords International Relations and Defense Select Committee. I would be remiss in the week before Christmas by not highlighting a successful breakthrough with the announcement, the Times, 9th of December, by the Prime Minister of a multi-billion-pound deal brokered for supplying Japan with the Tempest, a 6th-generation fighter jet which will enter service in 2035 and can be flown with or without a pilot. BAE Systems, as reported in the Daily Telegraph 22nd May, was rumored to most likely replace Lockheed Martin as the principal partner for substituting the Mitsubishi F-2 fighter jet, largely modeled on the F-16 and in service as a workhorse since the 1990s. BAE Systems will produce the Tempest under the aegis of the Global Combat Air Program in an equal partnership with the Italian aerospace giant Leonardo. It is a historical first since the end of the war, a major Anglo-Japanese defense collaboration. Our MOD has already committed 2 billion sterling to the project until 2025, with similar sums pledged by the Italians and Japanese. A prototype will be ready by the middle of this decade, and a PwC PricewaterhouseCoopers report released last year surmised that the Tempest would support 21,000 jobs and profit the exchequer up to 26.2 billion sterling. Happy Christmas and Advance Britannia.
Thank you, Burzine.